TheAnswer.com. Now, from the Signature Bank Studios. This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft on AM 560. The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan Proft here. Betty Yee is a former statewide official in California. She was the controller. She's also running for governor. She went on Piers Morgan's show because mashed potato lady Katie Porter won't answer questions. Piers Morgan was sure to make reference to that. And he got into the question of men playing women's sports. You know, the Olympics are coming to L.A., so it's not an inconsequential question. And Piers Morgan is a California resident, so, he wants to hear from those running to be the next governor, wants to hear their positions on the issue. Betty Yee may answer questions unlike Katie Porter, but she's not great at it.
Out of interest, Betty Yee, what is your view of trans athletes in women's sport?
Well, I think I always want to be sure that we are being inclusive in sports. And so I think there are ways to still have them participate in sports and try to quell, just some of the controversy around it. I think everyone has an opportunity to participate in sports.
Right. That wasn't really the question. It's whether you think trans athletes should compete in women's sport.
Well, I think we need to learn more about just how we can enable them to participate. Look, everyone is competing in a sport, and they come with abilities, and perhaps there could be kind of a different league for them, or we can look at just ways not to exclude them, but I do want them to be able to have that same opportunity to participate.
Well, everybody wants trans athletes to be able to participate in sport. The issue is whether they should be allowed to compete in women's sport against actual women who are biological females who obviously have a inferior physiology in the main in terms of lung capacity, muscle mass, and so on. Do you think that would be right?
They are now part of, they have been through a transition, a physical transition, and I do believe that they should be able to participate with other female athletes.
Wow, well, you've got the Olympics coming to California, to LA. So are you suggesting that you would allow trans athletes to compete in women's sport in the Olympics if you were governor?
Well, I think there's still a lot of discussion that needs to happen. I think there's a lot of information we need to learn about what's really happening with the ability of trans athletes to compete. But my statement is about being able to be sure that they can compete. And right now,
but my question is whether you think they should compete in women's sport in the Olympics, because it's coming to LA, so it's relevant.
I think transgender female athletes are women athletes.
Okay, we finally got... It's laborious, isn't it? We finally got to it. She hasn't given this a lot of thought because she went from a separate league to trans women are the same as biological women. And then she wants to go even further. This was painstaking for Piers Morgan to pull this out of her. But he eventually got there. By the way, another question for her is this whole we don't know how trans men will perform, men who are trans women will perform against women. Well, we do know. And we also know how they were performing against men. I mean, name me a male athlete who was dominant or even competitive in their sport that transitioned and played women's sports. Right. But in terms of the Olympics, Piers Morgan pressed the issue, and ultimately we got to a very different place than even she stopped there.
But it seems to me like you would like to remove any sexual differentiation between the Olympic sports and let them all compete. It would be gender neutral, would it, if you were governor?
Well, I want to be sure that everyone has the ability to compete.
Right, but would you have a gender neutral Olympics where you would have you wouldn't have male and female sport then? You just have one that everyone could join in.
Well, I don't think we're going to get that tomorrow, but I think it's a conversation worth having.
You think it's a conversation worth having where you have gender-neutral Olympics?
Because we need to understand what the attributes are of athletes across the spectrum.
But you've already said that you understand the reason they separate the sexes is that men have a physical advantage over women. That is why we separate the sexes in the Olympics.
In some sports, I believe so.
Tell me a sport where it would have no impact.
I do believe that women are equipped to break records in track and field and some
Tell
other
me one
sports as
track
well.
and field event where a woman would beat a man in the Olympics.
Well, if
In fact, let me make it
there's a
easier. Tell me a single track and field event in the Olympics where a woman would qualify for any of the finals.
Well, I would think that in some of the in the short course, track events. Potentially.
What do you mean? Like how long?
It's not going to be the long races, but the shorter races.
What, 100 meters, 200 meters?
Could be 100-meter, sure.
You think? I'm sorry to Betty, but given that obviously I got you on because Katie Porter wouldn't answer questions, you genuinely think that we should have a gender-neutral 100 meters in the Olympics when it comes to California?
What I am saying is, I don't know that we know fully. We know fully.
But why do you think? We do know fully because we know that women's 100-meter records compared to men's show that men are much, much faster over 100 meters than women. That's why we separate the sexes. Same with 200 meters, same with 400 meters, same with 5,000 meters, same with 800 meters, same with 10,000 meters. That is why we separate the sexes. If you had men and women competing in the same Olympic track and field events, women would never win a medal again. How do you not know that?
Well, let me just say this. I think we can all agree that we want people to have equal opportunity to participate. I don't know that we know, frankly, just with transgender people participating in athletics, really how they would fare in competition. So I would like to be able to see full participation. And if it means having to put transgender people in a different type of division to see how they perform, we would do that.
I mean, there are people that are running for high office like Betty Yee, who, as I said, is a statewide official or was in California. She's all over the place, arguing with herself as Pierce Morgan just, breaks her down like any grade schooler could do over the ridiculousness of her position. She went from a separate league to they're female athletes, men pretending to be women, are female athletes, to let's have a gender-neutral Olympics. I mean, the only way imagine Usain Bolt running against women. The only way a woman would qualify the finals in the 100-meter in the Olympics is if Usain Bolt put her on his shoulders. Of course, everybody knows this. And then she ends going back to a separate league. This gender ideology, if you didn't understand how lobotomizing it is, I hope Betty Yee has persuaded you. For more on the topic, not specifically this, but the news out last week that we discussed about the decline in identification as trans going on among Gen Z, perhaps some of the social contagion is wearing off. Pleased to be joined by Chris Ferguson, professor of psychology at Stetson University in Florida, author of Catastrophe, The Psychology of Why Good People Make Bad Situations Worse. You can also get his writings at grimoiremanor.substack.com. Professor Ferguson, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, good morning. It's always great to be on.
Thanks for joining us again. That was quite a tour de force from Betty Yee, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was both funny and difficult to listen to.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Wonderful. So one of the things that you wrote about recently is there was this thesis about social media and its impact on young people identifying as trans, like basically that they were that they were directly proportional. That as you use more social media, there was a higher likelihood that you would identify as trans, and that is been perhaps debunked with the news out last week about declining rates of trans identification.
Yeah, that does seem to be where things are headed. So, what happened basically is in the 2010s, we saw this, pretty well documented rise of young people, whether they're teenagers or young adults, identifying either as trans or non-binary. And that continued, through, somewhere around 2020, 2021. And Eric Kaufman has been crunching the numbers more recently. And it's made kind of headlines last week. It seems like those numbers are now coming down. There are less individuals who are identifying as non-binary. A pretty significant decline over time. And I think one of the things that got missed, that Kaufman pointed out, he kind of tried to tease apart, why this may be happening. And he kind of talked about, mental health is improving in young people, and that is probably one part of the picture here. But he also pointed out that, access to social media, the time that kids are spending on social media has not really changed. So kids are still using as much, if not more, social media than they have beforehand. So even though that particular variable has not changed, we're seeing these, non-binary, identifications coming down. So it's suggesting, along with some other data that also come out recently, it's suggesting that, there probably is some kind of, social transmission that's going on or social incentive, but it doesn't seem to be coming primarily from social media, as a lot of people worried about in the 2010s.
Yeah, it's more, I'm fond of saying that what a society extols, it begets. So it's more just the celebratory atmosphere around the whole thing, and it's not limited to social media. Social media is just one aspect of the transmission of cultural norms, but it's just one channel or a couple, or one form of a channel. There are many other channels too, and the same things are going on, not to mention institutional celebration like in government K through 12 school systems.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, a situation was set up where there were both, incentives and disincentives. So, the exchange we just listened to, I think, kind of points to that disincentive, right? People weren't allowed to challenge. If someone said that they were trans, you couldn't ask them to prove it, in any, meaningful way. And I think that's where you hear the tension in that interview is, someone who knows what they're saying maybe doesn't make a lot of sense, but on the same point, feel like they're going to get in trouble if they, don't kind of, toe the party line, if you will, for a little bit. And so I think you ended up in a situation where, for young people, if they came out with, they, them pronouns or identified as trans, nobody could question them, and they were treated as heroes, and you're so brave. And so there were a lot of these incentives that were in place. And at the same point, there were a lot of disincentives. So if you were an adult or a teacher or a physician, you were not allowed to say, well, this individual was born male and he's using they, them pronouns. He, dyed his hair pink, whatever, but he's still dating women, and he's still basically living a pretty guyish life. So maybe this is kind of, just a bad, for this individual at least. And I think it was just very difficult to point out that, maybe for some of these individuals, identifying as non-binary or trans really does help them live some authentic lives. But for other individuals, they might have had mental health issues, or maybe, they were just, a straight dude trying to get with the girls in the gender studies class, kind of a thing. It really wasn't, it really wasn't an authentic, portrayal. And I think it's okay to kind of
or maybe they were trying to get on the medal stand in college swimming meets.
Yeah, there was that aspect of this too. We did see at least some biological male athletes who did not do particularly well in male sports, then switch over to female sports, and then shatter records and all this kinds of stuff. And for a while there was a sense of if this person says that they're a woman, then nobody's allowed to challenge that. And personally, I'm okay using people's pronouns and that sort of stuff. But when it comes down to women are not going to be able to compete in their own sports, or at least not win in their own sports. Or they may be injured because there's a biological male who has a bigger body, a bigger bones, and that kinds of stuff. And I think that creates a lot of problems. And I think those problems became pretty obvious. And eventually, you can kind of stop people from talking for a while with these disincentives. But if you're really required to say things that are just not true, that becomes very difficult for people for long periods of time.
I also think that detransitioners who have come forward and spoken about the mistake they feel they now made, and why and how they were led down, a primrose path, so to speak, like Chloe Cole, have been impactful too. I know there's been an assiduous effort by the legacy media to ignore them, but it gets out and around, and there's some real horror stories, tragic stories, and sympathetic people who are trying to be helpful and say, don't make the same mistakes that I made, think this through a little bit more, and so on and so forth. And that's impactful too.
Yeah, and that's exactly true. And and there was a situation where we were told all over and over to listen to people's voices, and on the other hand, we weren't allowed to listen to their voices, and they're part of the puzzle too, and I think that there's been more information that's come to light, about that. And again, I think I'm open to the idea there may be some individuals who do benefit from some kind of social or medical transition, but there are a lot of individuals who don't, necessarily benefit from that as well. And being able to distinguish between those groups of individuals, by some kind of rigorous psychological evaluation, it shouldn't be that controversial, but it was really controversial to say something like that, 5 years ago. But I think we're moving out of that period at this point.
Well, and also too, I mean, there should be, at minimum, there should be a bright line between adults and children. I mean, that's been the biggest issue that's been fought out at the state level legislatively, as is like, we're just not going to have state participation in mutilating kids. At least that's the argument.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and there was this sense of, in so many ways, we regulate kids' lives and that kind of stuff, and maybe we do overdo it in some ways. But all of a sudden, for this particular issue, there was a sense of like, any kid who, that they're 11 years old who says that they're trans, and we have to believe them. There could be no psychological evaluation. There could be no questioning whatsoever. Kids know, who they are. It's like, I don't know. Have you met any kids?
Right.
Right. A lot of them are. A lot of adults don't know who they are. Really, is the reality of it. So assuming that everyone who was 11, 12, or 13, absolutely knew what they were doing. Again, I'm open to the idea there may be some kids that would benefit, but a lot of them clearly did not. And I think that it's okay to take have the rigorous evaluation, maybe do a bit more of a wait and see approach. Make sure everybody knows, including the parents, what the real side effects of a lot of the medical interventions can be, so that people can make a much more educated decision. But I think a lot of kids were kind of rushed through by physicians and therapists, who, again, their incentives were to show how morally good they were by, believing the children and this sort of thing. And so there were a lot of these kind of, perverse incentives that I think reduced a lot of critical thinking, a lot of caution, a lot of care around this particular issue.
The other thing, too, is just on social media in general, and just in terms of what sort of impact it's really having on I guess Gen Z now. I mean, millennials are past post, so Gen Z and the generations coming up behind them.
Yeah.
Brandon Johnson, he's the mayor of Chicago, unfortunately. He recently proposed a social media tax, because social media should be treated as a vice like alcohol or tobacco. And you hear a lot about that, and I'm not saying that 8 hours of screen time is a good thing, and there's not some measurable intellectual or social emotional stunting that could go along with that sort of constancy. But the studies that I've read about don't seem to provide a causal link between social media and destructive social behaviors. And so, that whole sort of comparison to it as a vice like alcohol and tobacco seems to me a bit overwrought.
Well, everybody wants to be the new smoking and lung cancer. So we kind of see this, comparison come up every single time there's kind of a moral panic around anything, really. As everybody starts talking about smoking and cigarettes, and that's in some ways kind of a red flag that you're using emotional language rather than scientific one. But absolutely, and I think what happens is people, just like happened with video games beforehand and rock music and even the radio and stuff, is you can look at some of the stuff that happens on social media, and some of it is gross. I mean, there's no question whatsoever. And I'm a parent, my kid's an adult now, but there is a sense of like, we want to shield our kids from, things that are, gross or disgusting or whatever. That's fair enough. But there is also this question about, like, what is the real impact, of these things if we're worried about mental health or things like that. And the evidence increasingly suggests that, however, good or bad social media is as sort of entertainment content, that we can't even really find clear correlations, let alone causation. It just doesn't seem to be that at least time spent on social media is predictive of youth mental health. And actually, again, in concert with the sort of reductions in identification as non-binary, according to CDC data, youth mental health has actually been improving, over the last few years. Actually, much better than for middle-aged adults, which is interesting.
Well, they're not locked in their room anymore. That helps. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we're not even really seeing a correlation here, let alone a causation. So if we're really serious about, youth mental health, really the kind of predictors of that seem to be problems in the family. So if your parent is, suicidal, or your parent is addicted to opiates, or your parent is in prison, things like that, as well as schools. Kids keep trying to tell us that schools stink, that 70 to 80% of kids are telling us that schools are boring and stressful. So those seem to be the two areas that are really having, a real problem for kids is, some kids just have difficulties with their families. It's not always the parents' fault. Sometimes the parents are struggling, and we also have a lot of problems with our schools in the U.S. And those are probably the areas we should be paying a lot more attention to, not trying to ban, social media, which, you're probably going to end up with First Amendment issues anyway, that, you can't really tag, speech that you don't like, is the reality. We saw that proposed with video games, and it didn't work.
Chris Ferguson is a professor of psychology at Stetson University in Florida, author of Catastrophe, The Psychology of Why Good People Make Bad Situations Worse. You can read his musings at grimoiremanor.substack.com as well. Professor Ferguson, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me on. It's always a pleasure.
And he joined us on the Turnkey.Pro answer line.
This is the morning show more Chicago radio listeners are choosing. This is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
Hi, I'm Ken Mariotti, owner of Woodland Windows and Doors, a third-generation family-owned business since 1969. We know you're bombarded by choices when shopping for new windows or doors, so we're inviting you to experience the Woodland difference. For decades, we have been transforming living spaces with Marvin Windows, a fifth-generation family business. Marvin replacement windows have been known